50 years of bitter estrangement ended with a single insulting inheritance, a rusted, worthless 1954 Ford pickup. At 78, Walter thought it was a final, cruel joke from beyond the grave. He was wrong. Hidden beneath decades of rot and grime lay $45 million in solid, untraceable gold. The letter arrived on a dismal Tuesday in late November, bearing the crisp embossed letterhead of Garrison Miller and Associates, a high-end estate law firm based in Portland, Oregon. Walter Higgins, a 78-year-old retired machinist living in a cramped duplex in Scranton, Pennsylvania, stared at the heavy parchment as if it were laced with poison. It was about his older brother, Samuel. Samuel Higgins had been dead to Walter for precisely 52 years. In the winter of 1974, Samuel, always the charismatic grifter, had convinced Walter to co-sign a massive loan to purchase heavy dredging equipment for a guaranteed gold claim on the Rogue River. Within 6 months, the money vanished. The claim turned out to be a barren stretch of bedrock, and Samuel disappeared into the Pacific Northwest without a word. Walter was left holding the bag. The crushing debt had cost Walter his house, his credit, and ultimately his marriage. For 5 decades, Walter had scraped by on factory wages and sheer, stubborn spite, while Samuel became a phantom, sending only the occasional manic postcard, babbling about secret veins and government conspiracies. Now Samuel was actually dead. Heart failure at 81. Sitting in his faded armchair, Walter read the attorney's words with a tight jaw. The rest of Samuel's modest liquid assets, a few thousand in a local credit union, had been distributed to distant cousins, but Samuel had left a specific legally binding addendum for Walter. To my brother, Walter Higgins, I leave the entirety of my physical estate located on the property at 114 Miller Creek Road, Tuke State Forest, specifically the 1954 Ford F-100. He always loved machines more than people. Let him have this one. It was a slap in the face, a final mocking laugh echoing from a fresh grave. Walter's first instinct was to throw the letter into his electric fireplace. He had no desire to fly across the country to claim a pile of automotive scrap, but the property, according to the lawyer, was slated for foreclosure by the county within the month. If Walter didn't clear the vehicle off the lot, he'd be hit with environmental disposal fines. Samuel had managed to saddle him with one last debt. Fueled by a slow-burning fury, Walter withdrew the last of his meager savings, booked a budget flight to Portland, and rented a cheap sedan. He was going to sell the damn truck to the nearest scrapyard, sign the papers, and spit on the dirt where his brother had lived. The drive into the Tuke State Forest was a descent into a damp emerald purgatory. The Oregon rain was relentless, turning the winding logging roads into slick ribbons of mud. When Walter finally pulled up to 114 Miller Creek Road, his heart sank. Samuel's estate was a dilapidated moss-end cabin, leaning precariously against a massive Douglas fir. The yard was a graveyard of rusted oil drums, rotting lumber, and overgrown blackberry brambles, and sitting dead center in the knee-high weeds was the inheritance. The 1954 Ford F-100 was a corpse of a vehicle. Its original cherry-red paint had long ago surrendered to a cancerous, flaky brown rust. The windshield was a spider web of shattered glass. The tires were dry-rotted and sunk deep into the mud, and the wooden planks of the truck bed had completely rotted away, leaving only the dark steel frame exposed to the elements. Walter stood in the freezing drizzle, staring at the ruin. He felt an agonizing ache in his knees and a deeper, sharper ache in his chest. "You miserable son of a bitch," Walter whispered to the empty woods. 50 years, and this is your grand apology." He pulled his flip phone from his jacket and dialed the number of a local salvage yard he'd found in town. A gruff dispatcher quoted him $200 for the scrap metal, minus a $100 towing fee. Walter agreed instantly. He just wanted it gone. While waiting for the tow truck, Walter sought shelter on the sagging porch of the cabin. The front door was padlocked, sealed with a yellow county notice. He didn't care to go inside. He just watched the rain beat down on the rusted hood of the Ford, thinking about the decades he had lost, the double shifts at the machine shop, the lonely holidays. An hour later, a heavy-duty diesel tow truck rumbled up the muddy driveway. The driver, a bulky man in his 40s, wearing a grease-stained raincoat with the name Mitchell stitched on the breast, stepped out and eyed the Ford with visible disgust. "That the junker?" Mitchell asked, spitting a stream of tobacco into the weeds. "That's it?" Walter said, pulling his collar tight against the wind. "Just hook it up and let's get the paperwork over with." Mitchell unspooled the thick steel cable from his winch, dragged it through the mud, and hooked it securely around the Ford's front axle. "All right, Pop, stand back. These old brakes are probably seized solid, so she's going to drag." Mitchell climbed back into the cab and engaged the winch. The diesel engine roared and the heavy steel cable pulled taut, vibrating like a guitar string. The tow truck groaned. The winch motor winded in a high-pitched, agonizing frequency. But the Ford didn't move, not an inch. Mitchell frowned, revved the engine, and engaged the hydraulic lift to try and yank the front end out of the mud. The front tires of the massive tow truck actually lifted an inch off the ground, the suspension squealing in protest. The Ford remained absolutely planted as if its axles were bolted to the Earth's core. Mitchell killed the engine and hopped out, looking bewildered. He kicked the Ford's front tire. "What in the hell does your brother have in the bed of this thing?" "Lead bars." "It's empty," Walter said, stepping out into the rain. "You can see right through the rusted bed." "Ain't no way," Mitchell muttered, shining a heavy flashlight under the truck's undercarriage. "I haul 1-ton Julies that come up easier than this. This winch is rated for $12,000 lb. This little Hafton Ford shouldn't weigh more than 3,000. Mitchell wiped the rain from his face, looking suddenly suspicious. "Look, mister, my winch is overheating. I ain't snapping a cable and taking my head off for $100. I gotta go back to the yard and get the heavy-duty rotator rig. It's going to cost you double." Walter clenched his jaw but nodded. "Fine, just get it done. Be back in 2 hours," Mitchell grunted, unhooking his cable and tossing it into his rig. He drove off, leaving Walter alone in the deafening silence of the rainy forest. Walter walked over to the Ford. His machinist's brain, dormant for a few years but still sharp, began to itch. Mitchell was right. Something was mathematically wrong. A 1954 F-100, hollowed out by rust and stripped of its interior, should have popped out of the mud like a cork. Walter ignored his aching joints and dropped to his knees in the wet gravel. He pulled a small pen light from his pocket and peered beneath the truck. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The body of the truck was a rusted, brittle shell, but the chassis beneath it was entirely different. The original lightweight frame had been heavily reinforced. Thick, custom-cut steel plates a full 3/4 of an inch thick had been masterfully welded along the entire length of the undercarriage. Walter recognized the beadwork. It was flawless. Professional TIG welding. Samuel's handiwork. Walter shined the light toward the rear. The original leaf springs were gone. In their place was a massive commercial-grade suspension system ripped from a semi-truck featuring heavy-duty coilovers and an air ride system that had long since deflated, and nestled between the massive reinforced frame rails, sitting exactly where the gas tank should have been, was a custom fabricated steel box. It was enormous, roughly 5 ft long, 3 ft wide, and 2 ft deep. It was painted flat black, coated in thick rubberized undercoating to resist rust, and secured to the frame with massive high-tensile steel bolts. Because the original wooden floor of the truck bed had rotted away, Walter was looking directly at the top of this box. Why would Samuel build a bomb-proof heavy-duty payload box onto the bottom of a worthless truck while letting the exterior rot to disguise it? A strange, cold adrenaline flooded Walter's system. He scrambled up, his knees popping, and ran to his rental car. He popped the trunk and grabbed the only tool available, a heavy 2F steel tire iron. He hurried back to the truck and climbed into the bed. The steel box was flush with the frame. It had no obvious hinges, no keyholes, but running his bare, freezing hands along the lip, Walter felt a seam sealed with hard automotive silicone. He jammed the flat end of the tire iron into the seam and threw his entire 78-year-old weight against it. The iron slipped, tearing the skin off his knuckles. Walter didn't feel the pain. He wedged it in again, using the rusted frame of the truck as leverage. He pushed until his vision went spotty, his breath coming in ragged gasps. With a sharp crack, the silicone seal broke. Walter realized the top of the box was a heavy steel lid secured by hidden interior latches that had rusted just enough to give way. He jammed his fingers under the heavy lid, tearing his fingernails, and heaved upward. The lid groaned, grinding against 50 years of dirt, and flipped backward with a heavy metallic clang that echoed through the woods. Walter wiped the rain and sweat from his eyes and looked inside. The interior of the box was lined with thick, heavy sheets of dull gray metal. Lead. Walter recognized it immediately. The box had been lined with lead to block moisture and to make it completely invisible to ground-penetrating radar or metal detectors. Packed tightly inside the lead-lined vault were rows upon rows of heavy olive-drab canvas bags. They looked like military surplus tied off with thick waxed cord. There were at least 40 of them, perfectly arranged to distribute weight over the rear axle. Walter reached down and grabbed the neck of the nearest bag. He tried to lift it with one hand, but it didn't budge. It was staggeringly heavy, dense in a way that defied its small size. Using both hands and groaning with effort, he managed to heave the single bag, no larger than a loaf of bread, onto the rusted edge of the truck bed. It had to weigh 50 laid-b, his hands trembling violently. Walter pulled a pocket knife from his coat and sawed through the thick waxed cord. He peeled back the thick canvas flap. Under the gray sky of the Oregon forest, a dull, buttery yellow gleam caught the ambient light. Walter stopped breathing. The world around him, the rain, the wind, the distant rushing of the creek, faded into a muffled hum. Inside the bag were stacked rectangular bricks. They were smooth, perfect, and heavy. Walter reached in and pulled one out. It was shockingly cold and filled his palm completely. He rubbed his thumb across the surface, wiping away a thin layer of condensation, revealing the deeply stamped markings pressed into the metal. Credit Swiss 10 Oz Fine Gold, 999.9. Fondere Walter stared at the bar. He blinked, expecting the hallucination to end. He rubbed his eyes. He looked down at the bar again. The serial number, 042981, was etched clearly beneath the Asaya's stamp. "Dear God," Walter whispered. He dropped the bar back into the bag. It landed against the others with a heavy, muffled clack that only high-density precious metal can make. He tore open a second bag, more bars. He tore open a third bag, deeper in the box. This one contained no neat Swiss stamps. Instead, it was filled with crude hand-poured ingots, dull and rough around the edges, stamped only with a crude pickaxe symbol and the numbers 1898. Historical bullion. Walter's mind began to race, performing the brutal math of a machinist. One bag held roughly $50. $50 was about 720 troy ounces. If gold was trading around $2,000 an ounce, that meant one single canvas bag held nearly $1.5 million. He looked at the vault. There were at least 30, maybe 40 bags stacked inside. He wasn't looking at a retirement fund. He was looking at $45 million in solid, untraceable gold. A wave of intense vertigo washed over him. Walter staggered back against the side of the truck bed, gripping the rusted metal to keep from collapsing. His chest heaved. Samuel hadn't squandered the money. The crazy bastard hadn't been chasing phantom claims. He had actually found it or stolen it or something much, much worse. Suddenly, the isolation of the forest felt profoundly threatening. The trees seemed to close in. The sound of the rain sounded like footsteps. $45 million wasn't lottery money. It was the kind of money people vanished over. It was the kind of money cartels, governments, and private syndicates killed for without a second thought. And the tow truck driver, Mitchell, was coming back. Panic, sharp and icy, pierced Walter's shock as tall. If Mitchell brought the heavy-duty rig and lifted the truck, the suspension would hang loose, the vault would be exposed, and a man who works for $100 a tow would suddenly realize he was hoisting the GDP of a small island. Walter would be dead before sunset. He had to hide it. He had to cover the box. As he reached down to slam the heavy steel lid shut, his eye caught something tucked between two canvas bags in the corner of the vault, a small weathered leather journal bound by a brittle rubber band. Walter snatched it up, shoved it deep into the inner pocket of his coat, and threw his weight against the steel lid. It slammed shut with a heavy thud. He scraped the dried, broken bits of silicone over the seam, trying to make it look undisturbed, and kicked a pile of wet, rotting leaves from the truck bed over the exposed metal. He jumped down from the truck just as the low, guttural roar of a heavy diesel engine echoed through the trees. But as Walter looked down the muddy driveway, his blood ran cold. It wasn't Mitchell's tow truck. A sleek, heavily tinted black SUV was creeping up the rooted road, its suspension absorbing the deep potholes with an eerie smoothness. It didn't look like a county vehicle. It didn't look like local law enforcement. It looked like a predator. The SUV rolled to a stop, blocking the rental car, its headlights cutting through the rain and pinning Walter against the rusted corpse of the Ford F-100. 50 years of silence. And now, the moment Walter uncovered the secret, the wolves had arrived. The heavy doors of the black SUV opened with a synchronized, terrifying click. 2 men stepped out into the freezing Oregon rain. They did not look like local law enforcement, nor did they look like the kind of men who worked in the woods. The driver was built like a concrete pillar, his eyes concealed behind dark sunglasses despite the dismal weather, but it was the passenger who made Walter's blood turn to ice. He was a tall, lean man wearing a tailored charcoal overcoat that repelled the rain like an oily second skin. He moved with a terrifying, deliberate grace. The tall man approached the rusted Ford, his polished leather shoes sinking slightly into the mud. He stopped a few feet away, his cold, pale eyes locking onto Walter. "Walter Higgins," the man said. It was not a question. His voice was smooth, carrying the refined, dangerous cadence of corporate ruthlessness. "My name is Harrison. I represent an independent logistics firm with a vested interest in your late brother's estate. We have been waiting a very long time for Samuel to expire, and an equally long time for you to finally arrive. Step away from the vehicle, please, and speak with me." Walter swallowed the dry lump of panic rising in his throat. He forced his hands to stop trembling, leaning heavily against the muddy fender of the Ford. He needed to play the part of the bitter, clueless sibling perfectly. "I do not care who you are," Walter barked, projecting a raspy, exhausted irritation. "If you are looking for money, you are 50 years too late. That miserable bastard stole everything I had in 1974. He left me nothing but this worthless pile of automotive scrap and a mountain of unpaid property taxes." "You can have the damp cabin?" Harrison smiled, a thin, humorless expression that did not reach his eyes. Samuel was many things, Mr. Higgins, but he was certainly not broke. Our firm invested heavily in his Rogue River dredging operation decades ago. He claimed the operation was a total failure, but our analysts recently uncovered discrepancies. We believe Samuel found something substantial, something he managed to successfully hide from us for half a century. We know he never spent any wealth. We know he lived like a filthy hermit, which means his legacy is still physically located somewhere on this miserable, rotting, heavily overgrown property. "Then get a shovel and start digging," Walter snapped, kicking the rusted tire of the Ford for emphasis. "Because I am waiting for a tow truck to haul this eyesore to the local scrapyard, and then I am flying back to Pennsylvania. If he buried gold out here, I hope you break your backs looking for it." Harrison stared at him, searching for a lie in the old man's weathered face. After a long, agonizing silence, Harrison nodded to his bulky driver. "Tear the cabin apart. Check the floorboards. The walls and the foundation leave no stone completely unturned." The driver moved toward to the cabin, producing a heavy steel pry bar from beneath his coat. Walter watched him shatter the padlock with a single brutal swing. As the driver disappeared inside, the deep, guttural blast of a heavy diesel air horn echoed through the trees. Mitchell had returned. A massive 10-ton rotator tow truck rumbled up the muddy driveway, its amber lights flashing brightly through the gloomy rain. Mitchell laid on the horn again, forcing Harrison to step back as the enormous yellow rig maneuvered aggressively into the tight space, completely blocking the black luxury SUV from moving. Mitchell hopped out of the cab, looking even angrier than before. "Move that fancy hearse," Mitchell shouted at Harrison, pointing a grease-stained finger at the SUV. "I need clearance for the outriggers, or this truck is going to slide right into the creek." Harrison looked extremely annoyed but gestured for his driver, who had just stepped out of the cabin, to move the vehicle. Harrison clearly did not want a messy confrontation with a loud local working man that could draw unwanted police attention. While the SUV backed away, Mitchell stomped over to the Ford and began unspooling a massive steel chain. "All right, Pop, let us get this dead weight moving," Mitchell grunted. Walter's heart pounded furiously against his ribs. This was the most dangerous moment. If Mitchell hoisted the truck and the massive weight of the concealed steel vault snapped the ancient chassis, the gold would spill directly into the mud right in front of Harrison. Mitchell engaged the hydraulic outriggers, stabilizing his massive rig. He attached the heavy chain securely to the reinforced frame rails beneath the Ford's front bumper. "Stand back!" Mitchell yelled over the roar of the diesel engine. He pulled the heavy hydraulic levers. The rotator winch winded, winding the thick steel cable with immense, terrifying mechanical power. The front of the rusted Ford groaned in violent protest. Flakes of brown rust rained down into the wet mud, but Samuel's masterful welding held strong. The reinforced steel chassis did not bend. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy truck was lifted entirely off the ground, suspended by the massive chains. The thick layer of black, rubberized undercoating perfectly camouflaged the heavy steel vault bolted to the undercarriage. To the untrained eye, it just looked like an oversized gas tank coated in 50 years of thick forest grime. Harrison barely glanced at the suspended truck, his focus entirely on the dilapidated wooden cabin. "Where are we taking this piece of junk?" Mitchell asked, wiping freezing rain from his flushed face. Walter pulled his damp wallet from his pocket. He extracted 5 crisp $100 bills, his emergency travel cash. "Plans changed," Walter said softly, pressing the money into Mitchell's callous hand. "I do not want to scrap it today. I need you to tow it to a secure public storage facility over in Portland. I will rent a garage unit." Mitchell looked at the cash, shrugged his heavy shoulders, and nodded. "Your money, your rules, boss. Hop in the cab. Let us get out of this mud." Walter climbed into the warm cab of the tow truck. As they rolled down the muddy driveway, pulling the heavily laden Ford behind them, Walter looked out the passenger window. Harrison was standing on the sagging porch of the ruined cabin, watching them leave with a look of supreme indifference. The corporate wolves were going to spend weeks tearing up empty dirt, looking for a treasure that was currently rolling away right under their arrogant noses. Walter let out a long, shaky breath, feeling the crushing tension slowly drain from his old bones. He had actually survived the impossible encounter. 3 hours later, the Ford was safely deposited inside a heavy concrete storage unit for the heavy metal garage door rolled shut. Walter was finally completely alone. The silence of the dry concrete room was utterly deafening. He walked over to the rusted truck, his legs feeling like they were made of heavy lead. He reached into the inner pocket of his damp jacket and pulled out the small weathered leather journal he had snatched from the secret vault. He sat on an overturned plastic bucket and carefully opened the fragile pages. The handwriting was undeniably Samuel's, frantic, sharp, and heavily slanted. The first entry was dated August of 1974. "Walter, if you are reading this, I am already dead, and you are understandably furious. I never lost our money. The dredging equipment worked perfectly. We actually hit the main artery of the legendary lost Blue Bucket vein on the second week, but the local logging syndicate found out. They murdered our foreman and came for me. If they knew you co-signed the loan, they would have killed you too in a heartbeat. I had to make a drastic choice." Walter read the pages with wide, tear-filled eyes. Samuel had purposefully destroyed the operation to make it look like a tragic, complete failure. He took the blame, ruined his own reputation, and alienated Walter specifically to keep him completely off the dangerous syndicate's radar. For the next 50 years, Samuel lived in absolute poverty in the Oregon woods, sneaking back to the hidden cave system at night. He spent half a century secretly mining the vein by hand, smelting the raw gold in a hidden furnace, and converting it into untraceable Swiss bullion through a highly paranoid network of black market brokers. "I could not spend a single dime," the journal continued. If I bought a nice car or a new house, Harrison's men would know I found the gold. I had to live like a starving rat so you could live peacefully. The custom vault under this truck holds exactly $45 million in pure weight. The contact information for my broker in Geneva is on the last page. He knows to expect a man named Walter. I ruined your life to save it. Little brother, I'm incredibly sorry for the pain. Please buy your beautiful life back today. Walter closed the leather journal, warm tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. 50 years of bitter hatred simply vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, crushing wave of profound grief and intense love. Samuel was not a selfish grifter. He was a silent protector. He had sacrificed his entire existence, enduring 50 years of brutal, cold isolation and misery, just to ensure Walter survived to eventually inherit an empire. Walter stood up, walking over to the rusted Ford. He ran his hand affectionately along the cold, ruined metal of the hood. He was no longer a poor, forgotten machinist, waiting quietly to die alone in Scranton. Walter was now a multimillionaire with a very bright future. He pulled out his phone, ready to call Geneva. The real adventure was just beginning. Did the 50-year wait for an apology pay off in the most unbelievable way possible? This incredible, true-to-life saga of betrayal, hidden wealth, and ultimate redemption proves that some secrets are definitely worth digging for. If you are on the edge of your seat and want more thrilling stories of hidden fortunes and real-world mysteries, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel right now. Do not miss.